I never thought a patch of ice on my front steps would turn into a neighborhood war. But that's exactly what happened when Barbara Henderson decided to flex her HOA presidential powers on a bitter February morning in Naperville, Illinois. My name is Connor Fitzgerald, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Commons subdivision for 3 years without much trouble. Sure, the HOA had its quirks, like the time they sent me a warning about my mailbox flag being the wrong shade of red, but nothing that really got under my skin. That all changed when I came home from work on a Tuesday evening to find a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. The temperature had dropped to single digits that week, unusual even for Illinois winters. I worked long hours as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant in Aurora, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. That particular week, I had been pulling 12-hour shifts to meet a project deadline. The last thing on my mind was micromanaging ice formation on my property. I tore open the envelope, my fingers already numb from the walk between my car and the front door. The notice stated that I had violated Section 14.7 of the HOA guidelines regarding property maintenance and safety hazards. Apparently, ice had accumulated on my front steps, and this constituted a violation worthy of a $200 fine. The letter was signed by Barbara Henderson, HOA president, with a note at the bottom stating that payment was due within 10 days or additional penalties would apply. I stood in my foyer, staring at the paper in disbelief. The ice on my steps was minimal, just a thin glaze that had formed from melting snow refreezing overnight. I had salt in my garage and had been meaning to apply it, but between my brutal work schedule and the fact that I had barely used my front door that week, it had slipped my mind. I usually came and went through the garage, so I had not even noticed the ice until that moment. The fine seemed excessive, especially considering I had seen far worse violations around the neighborhood that went unaddressed. My neighbor 3 houses down had a broken gutter hanging by a thread for over a month. Another house on the corner had weeds growing through the cracks in their driveway that were nearly a foot tall. Yet somehow, a little ice on my steps warranted immediate action and a hefty fine. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday. If I was going to fight this, I needed to do it properly. In the meantime, I went out to my garage, grabbed the bag of ice melt, and thoroughly salted my front steps and walkway. The ice would not be an issue anymore, but the principle of the fine still bothered me. Thursday arrived, and I drove to the community center where the HOA meetings were held. The room was set up with folding chairs facing a long table where Barbara and the other board members sat. Barbara was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA president. She was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that specific way that required weekly salon visits. She wore a crisp blazer and had reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her expression was one of permanent disapproval, like she had just smelled something unpleasant. About 20 other homeowners were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking as thrilled to be there as I felt. I took a seat in the back and waited for the meeting to start. Barbara called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock, not a minute earlier or later. She went through the standard agenda items: approval of last meeting's minutes, treasurer's report, upcoming neighborhood events. Finally, she opened the floor for homeowner concerns. I raised my hand. Barbara's eyes landed on me, and I could have sworn I saw a flash of recognition and irritation cross her face. "Yes, Mr. Fitzgerald," she said, her voice clipped and formal. I stood up, holding the violation notice. "I want to discuss this fine I received. $200 for ice on my steps seems excessive, especially when there are other violations around the neighborhood that seem to be ignored. Barbara's expression did not change. The HOA board takes all violations seriously, Mr. Fitzgerald. Ice on steps presents a liability issue. If someone were to slip and fall on your property, you could be sued, and by extension, the HOA could be held liable. I understand that, I replied, keeping my voice calm. But I had been working long hours that week and had not noticed the ice. It was a minor accumulation, and I took care of it as soon as I saw the notice. I think a warning would have been more appropriate than an immediate $200 fine. The guidelines are clear, Barbara said, picking up a copy of the HOA handbook. Section 14.7 states that homeowners must maintain their property in a safe condition. Ice constitutes a hazard. The fine structure is also clearly outlined. There is a $200 penalty for safety violations. Another board member, a man in his 60s named Tom, leaned forward. Barbara, perhaps we could consider reducing the fine to a warning, given that this is Mr. Fitzgerald's first violation of this nature. Barbara shot him a look that could have frozen water. The rules apply to everyone equally, Tom. We cannot show favoritism. I felt my frustration building. I am not asking for favoritism. I am asking for common sense. If I had been given a warning, I would have addressed it immediately. Instead, I am being fined $200 for something that was fixed within hours of me being notified. The ice was present for at least 3 days before the notice was issued, Barbara countered. We have dated photographs. That caught me off guard. You have photographs, of course. The HOA conducts regular property inspections. We document all violations thoroughly. The fact that someone had been taking photographs of my property without my knowledge felt invasive, but technically, they were within their rights. HOA rules generally allowed for exterior inspections of properties. I tried a different approach. All right, then how about this? Can you show me the photos? I would like to see the extent of what you are calling a violation. Barbara hesitated for a moment, then shuffled through some papers in front of her. She pulled out a photograph and held it up. From where I was standing, I could barely make out my front steps with what appeared to be a slight sheen of ice. May I see it up close? I asked. Barbara reluctantly handed the photo to Tom, who passed it down the row of homeowners until it reached me. I examined it carefully. The ice was there, yes, but it was minimal. You could see the concrete of the steps clearly through it. This was not a dangerous accumulation that would send someone to the hospital. This was the kind of light glaze that happens when temperatures fluctuate. This is what warranted a $200 fine, I asked, holding up the photo. A few other homeowners craned their necks to see. One woman, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, spoke up. That does not look that bad, honestly. Barbara's face flushed slightly. The severity of the ice is not the issue. The issue is that it was present at all. Safety violations are taken very seriously. Then why has the broken gutter at 458 Maple been ignored for over a month? I challenged. That seems like a safety hazard too. We are addressing that situation, Barbara said curtly. Each violation is handled on a case-by-case basis. So some violations get months of leeway, and others get immediate fines. The room had gone quiet. Other homeowners were watching the exchange with interest. Barbara clearly did not like having her authority challenged in front of everyone. Mr. Fitzgerald, the fine stands. If you wish to appeal it, you can submit a written request to the board, and we will review it. But I can tell you now that the decision is unlikely to change. The rules exist for a reason, and we all agreed to follow them when we purchased our homes here. I sat back down, knowing I was not going to get anywhere tonight. The meeting continued with other mundane topics, but I barely paid attention. I was too busy thinking about what Barbara had said. Technically, she was right. I had signed the HOA agreement when I bought my house, but the selective enforcement and the excessive fine still felt wrong. After the meeting ended, I walked out to the parking lot, still holding the photograph. As I reached my car, Tom, the board member who had suggested reducing my fine, approached me. "Connor, right?" he asked. "Yeah, thanks for trying to back me up in there." Tom shook his head. "Barbara has been getting more aggressive with enforcement lately. Between you and me, I think she is trying to build up the HOA's reserve fund by issuing more fines. We are supposed to be replacing the community center roof this year, and the fund is a bit short." That information was enlightening and infuriating at the same time. "So I am being fined to pay for a roof?" "I did not say that officially," Tom said quickly. "Just giving you some context. Look, you could try the written appeal, but Barbara usually gets her way. She has got the other board members pretty much under her thumb. What about you?" "I am just one vote out of 5, Tom said with a shrug. "And honestly, I am planning to move next year anyway. My wife and I are downsizing. Not worth making waves." I thanked Tom for the information and drove home, my mind racing. The more I thought about it, the more the fine felt like a shakedown. But what could I do? I could pay it and move on, or I could fight it and probably lose anyway while making an enemy of the HOA president. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about Barbara's smug expression, the way she dismissed my concerns, the selective enforcement of rules. And then, around 2 in the morning, I had a realization. There was one thing I had been doing for the neighborhood all winter that I was not obligated to do. Something that benefited everyone, especially the people who lived on my street. And if the HOA wanted to be strict about rules and obligations, then maybe it was time I was equally strict about what I was and was not required to do. You see, the mailboxes for our street were clustered together at the end of the block in one of those communal mailbox stations. It was about 100 yards from my house. To get there, residents had to walk down a shared path that ran between properties. That path was technically common area, maintained by the HOA. However, the HOA's definition of maintenance was pretty minimal. They mowed it in the summer and that was about it. During winter, the path became treacherous. Snow would accumulate, then melt slightly during the day, then freeze solid at night, creating a slick surface. The HOA did not salt or plow the path. The first winter I lived there, I watched my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, nearly break her hip slipping on that path. After that, I started salting it myself. I would do my driveway and walkway, then take my spreader and salt the path all the way to the mailboxes. It took an extra 20 minutes and I went through a lot of salt, but it seemed like the neighborly thing to do. I never asked for recognition or reimbursement. I just did it because it made the neighborhood safer. And now, after being fined for a minor ice accumulation on my own property, I was done doing favors. The next morning, which was Friday, I woke up to fresh snowfall. About 3 inches had come down overnight, with temperatures hovering right around freezing, perfect conditions for creating dangerous ice. I got ready for work, then went out to my garage. I salted my driveway and my front walkway thoroughly, making sure every inch was covered. Then I put the salt spreader back in the garage and closed the door. I did not touch the shared path. As I drove past it on my way to work, I could see the snow already being compressed into slick patches by early morning foot traffic. Not my problem anymore, I thought. The weekend came and went. Temperatures stayed cold. I saw neighbors walking carefully down the path to get their mail, a few of them slipping but catching themselves. On Sunday morning, I was having coffee and looking out my front window when I saw Barbara herself making the trek to the mailboxes. She was moving slowly, arms out for balance. At one point, she slid a good 2 feet before grabbing onto a fence post to steady herself. Part of me felt bad. Most of me did not. Monday afternoon, I got home from work to find another orange notice on my door. My heart rate spiked. What now? This notice was not about ice. Instead, it stated that my garbage bins had been left out past the required time on Friday morning. Garbage pickup was Thursday, and bins were supposed to be brought back in by Friday at noon. Mine had still been visible from the street at 2 in the afternoon. Fine, $50. I actually laughed out loud. This was ridiculous. I had genuinely forgotten to bring the bins in because of my work schedule. It was a minor oversight, the kind that happens to everyone. But apparently, Barbara was watching me now, looking for any excuse to issue another fine. If she wanted to play this game, fine. 2 could play. I paid both fines online that night, not wanting to give them any excuse to add late fees or additional penalties. $450 total, which hurt, but I was not about to let them claim I was delinquent. Then I started documenting everything. I took photos of every violation I could find in the neighborhood. The broken gutter that was still hanging, weeds in driveways, a couple of houses with peeling paint. Someone had a small boat parked in their driveway, which I was pretty sure violated the no recreational vehicle storage rule. I documented it all with date-stamped photos. I also stopped any and all voluntary maintenance of common areas. No more salting the path. No more picking up litter that blew into the shared spaces. No more trimming back bushes that encroached from common areas onto my property line. If the HOA wanted to be militant about rules, then I would follow the rules exactly and nothing more. Wednesday brought freezing rain. The shared path became a skating rink. I watched from my window as people shuffled along it, some of them giving up and walking through the snow-covered grass instead. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman I had been worried about, actually fell. I saw it happen and rushed outside to help her up. She was shaken but unhurt, thankfully. "The HOA really should salt this path," she said, brushing snow off her coat. "You used to do it, Connor. Did they tell you to stop?" "No," I said carefully. "I just decided to focus on maintaining my own property." She gave me a knowing look. "I heard about your fine. Barbara is on a warpath this year. She fined me for having a wreath on my door past January 31st, said it violated the seasonal decoration policy." "She fined you for a wreath, $50. It was a Valentine's Day wreath, so I thought it was fine, but apparently not." This was getting out of hand. I helped Mrs. Patterson back to her house, then returned to my own, my anger simmering. Barbara was not just targeting me. She was going after everyone, nickel and diming the entire neighborhood. That night, I drafted a letter to the HOA board, outlining my concerns about selective enforcement and excessive fines. I cited specific examples of long-standing violations that had been ignored while minor infractions were being heavily penalized. I requested a full review of the current fine structure and enforcement policies. I made copies and mailed one to each board member individually. Friday evening, my phone rang. It was Tom from the board. "Connor, I got your letter," he said. "And just so you know, I agree with you. But I wanted to give you a heads up. Barbara is furious. She called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow to discuss what she is calling your harassment of the board." "Harassment? I sent a formal complaint through proper channels." "I know. But she is spinning it as you trying to undermine her authority. She is also claiming that your refusal to maintain the shared path is a violation of community standards." That made me sit up straight. The path is not my responsibility. It is a common area. Technically, Yes. But Barbara is arguing that by taking on the maintenance previously, you established a precedent, and discontinuing it without notice is a violation of the Community Spirit Clause. The Community Spirit Clause. That is not even enforceable. It is just vague language about being a good neighbor. You are preaching to the choir, Connor. I am just telling you what is coming. I thanked Tom and hung up, my mind reeling. This was escalating beyond anything I had anticipated. What started as a dispute over a minor fine was turning into a full-blown conflict. Saturday morning, I decided to attend the emergency board meeting. I was not officially invited, but HOA meetings were supposed to be open to homeowners, unless they were executive sessions about specific legal or financial matters. I showed up at the community center at the scheduled time and took a seat. Barbara looked surprised to see me, and not pleasantly so. The other board members filtered in, looking uncomfortable. Besides Barbara and Tom, there was Patricia, a woman in her 40s who always seemed nervous, Marcus, a man about my age who rarely spoke, and Denise, who was Barbara's best friend and usually voted however Barbara wanted. "This is a closed session," Barbara announced once everyone was seated. "According to what rule?" I asked calmly. "HOA meetings are open to homeowners unless they meet specific criteria for being closed. Is this about personnel, legal action, or confidential financial matters?" Barbara's jaw tightened. "It is about a personnel matter. You." "I am not HOA personnel. I am a homeowner. So unless you are discussing taking legal action against me, which would be absurd, this meeting should be open." Tom cleared his throat. "He has got a point, Barbara." "Fine," Barbara snapped. "Mr. Fitzgerald, you have submitted a letter to the board that contains serious accusations about selective enforcement and improper fine assessment. Do you have proof of these claims?" I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. "I have documented numerous violations throughout the neighborhood that have existed for weeks or months without any enforcement action. Meanwhile, minor violations are being fined immediately and heavily. I also have testimony from other homeowners who have been fined for questionable violations." "Are you accusing this board of improper conduct?" Barbara demanded. "I am saying that the enforcement has been inconsistent and appears to be financially motivated." Barbara stood up, her face flushed. "How dare you? This board works tirelessly to maintain property values and community standards. The fines we assess are in accordance with the bylaws that every homeowner agreed to." "Then why was the broken gutter at 458 Maple given months to be fixed while ice on my steps got an immediate $200 fine?" "That homeowner requested an extension due to financial hardship," Barbara said quickly. "So extensions are available, because that was not mentioned when I tried to discuss my fine." Patricia, the nervous board member, spoke up quietly. "Barbara, maybe we should review the enforcement procedures. There have been a lot of complaints lately from troublemakers who do not want to follow the rules." Barbara shot back. She turned to me. "And let us discuss your refusal to maintain the shared path. You took on that responsibility for 2 winters, and now you have suddenly stopped, creating a hazard." "The path is a common area," I said. "It is the HOA's responsibility to maintain it, not mine. I was doing it as a courtesy, not an obligation. A courtesy that people came to rely on. Mrs. Patterson fell on that path this week because you decided to throw a tantrum." That accusation hit me hard because I had felt guilty about Mrs. Patterson falling, but I pushed back. If Mrs. Patterson fell, it is because the HOA has failed to maintain a safe common area. That is your responsibility as the board. "We do not have the budget for that kind of maintenance," Marcus said, speaking up for the first time. It was a telling admission. Then maybe the budget should be allocated differently, I suggested. Or maybe the HOA should not be assessing questionable fines to pad the reserve fund. The room went silent. Barbara looked like she might explode. "Who told you that?" she demanded, her eyes darting to Tom. "Does it matter? Is it true?" "The HOA's financial decisions are made in the best interest of the community," Barbara said, her voice icy. "The reserve fund was low, and yes, we increased enforcement to ensure compliance and maintain the fund. That is responsible governance." "It is a shakedown," I said flatly. "You are targeting homeowners with excessive fines for minor violations to cover budget shortfalls." Patricia looked uncomfortable. "Barbara, if that is true, we should have discussed it as a board." "We did discuss it," Denise jumped in, defending her friend. "We all agreed that stricter enforcement was necessary." "I do not remember agreeing to use fines as a primary revenue source," Tom said carefully. The meeting devolved into an argument between the board members. I sat back and watched, realizing that I had exposed a deeper dysfunction in the HOA leadership. Barbara had been making decisions unilaterally or with only Denise's support, and the other board members were either unaware or had not been paying attention. Finally, Barbara regained control. "Enough. Mr. Fitzgerald, your fines stand. If you continue to refuse to maintain the shared path, you will be fined for violating the community spirit clause." "You cannot enforce that clause," I said. "It is too vague to be legally binding." "Try me," Barbara said coldly. I left the meeting knowing this was far from over. Barbara had essentially declared war, and I needed to figure out my next move. That evening, I did some research. I pulled up Illinois HOA laws and regulations, reading through everything I could find. I also looked into the specific bylaws for Meadowbrook Commons. What I found was interesting. First, the community spirit clause was indeed too vague to be enforceable. Any fine based solely on that would likely be overturned in court. Second, there were specific procedures for how fines were supposed to be assessed, including notification and an opportunity for a hearing before the fine was imposed. In my case, I had been fined immediately without any prior notice or hearing. That was a violation of the HOA's own procedures. Third, and most importantly, I found a provision that allowed homeowners to call for a special election to remove board members if they could get signatures from 20% of the homeowners. With about 150 houses in Meadowbrook Commons, that meant I needed 30 signatures. I decided to go for it. Sunday afternoon, I started going door to door. I was not asking people to sign a petition to remove the board just yet. First, I wanted to gauge how many other homeowners were unhappy with the current situation. I went to every house on my street first, talking to neighbors I knew. The response was overwhelming. Almost everyone had a story about an unfair fine or overly aggressive enforcement. Mrs. Patterson told me about her wreath fine again. Another neighbor, Jerry, had been fined for his grass being half an inch too long during a week when his mower was broken. The Thompsons had been fined because their house numbers were not visible enough from the street, even though they had been the same for 10 years without issue. By the end of the day, I had talked to 20 households, and every single one of them was fed up with Barbara and the current board. Many of them asked what they could do about it. The following weekend, I organized a meeting at my house for concerned homeowners. I was not sure how many people would show up, but I put together some snacks and drinks and sent out an invitation via the neighborhood Facebook group. 40 people came. My living room was packed, with people standing in the hallway and kitchen. The energy in the room was electric. Everyone was angry and ready to do something about it. I explained what I had learned about calling a special election. If we can get 30 signatures, we can force a vote to remove the current board members and elect new ones. We would need a majority of homeowners to vote in favor, but based on what I am hearing, I think we can get there. A man named David raised his hand. What happens after we remove them? Who runs the HOA? We would have a special election to fill the positions. Anyone can run. Ideally, we would elect people who are going to be fair and reasonable, not use the HOA as a personal fiefdom. I will run, Tom said from the back of the room. I had not even known he was there. I was planning to move, but I cannot watch this continue. Barbara has gone too far. Several other people volunteered to run as well. We talked for 2 hours, planning our strategy. By the end of the meeting, I had a petition drafted, and people were lining up to sign it. We got 30 signatures that night, and more people said they would spread the word. On Monday, I submitted the petition to the HOA board via certified mail, as required by the bylaws. I also posted about it on the neighborhood Facebook group, explaining what was happening and encouraging people to vote when the special election was held. Barbara's response came swiftly. By Wednesday, I had another orange notice on my door. This one stated that I was being fined $500 for organizing a meeting on my property without prior HOA approval. Apparently, there was a rule about gatherings of more than 25 people requiring approval to ensure adequate parking and noise control. I had not known about that rule, probably because it was buried on page 47 of the bylaws and had never been enforced before. But Barbara was clearly grasping at straws, trying to punish me for organizing against her. I did not pay that fine. Instead, I responded with a formal letter stating that the fine was retaliatory and that I would be pursuing legal action if it was not rescinded. I also filed a complaint with the Illinois Attorney General's office, which has oversight of HOA disputes. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. The HOA tried to claim that my petition was invalid due to technical issues with the signatures. They said some people had not printed their names clearly, others had not included their property addresses, things like that. I went back to every single person and got the signatures redone properly. I submitted the corrected petition, and this time, I made sure it was absolutely perfect. The HOA had no choice but to schedule the special election. According to the bylaws, it had to be held within 30 days of a valid petition being submitted. The date was set for March 15th. Barbara and her allies launched a campaign to save their positions. They sent out letters to all homeowners defending their record, claiming that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain property values. They accused me and the other petition organizers of trying to turn Meadowbrook Commons into a lawless community where people could do whatever they wanted. We launched our own campaign. We created a simple flyer outlining the issues: excessive fines for minor violations, selective enforcement, using fines as a revenue source, and lack of transparency in decision-making. We delivered the flyers to every house in the neighborhood. The Facebook group became a battleground. Barbara's supporters accused us of being troublemakers. We responded with specific examples of unfair enforcement. People who had been afraid to speak up before started sharing their stories publicly. The tide of public opinion was clearly against Barbara. The shared path to the mailboxes, meanwhile, remained unsalted. It had become a symbol of the dispute. Barbara kept insisting I was obligated to maintain it. I kept refusing. Several people fell or nearly fell, and each time it reinforced the message that the HOA was failing in its basic responsibilities. Finally, the HOA hired a service to salt and plow the path. It cost them $800 for the rest of the winter season, money that came out of the already strained reserve fund. I considered it a small victory. March 15th arrived. The election was held at the community center from 6 to 8 in the evening. The turnout was massive. Almost 100 homeowners showed up to vote, far more than ever attended a regular HOA meeting. I voted to remove all 5 board members and to elect the slate of new candidates that included Tom and 4 other homeowners who had stepped up to run. Then I waited. The votes were counted by a third-party management company that the HOA had hired to ensure fairness. By 9 o'clock, the results were announced. The motion to remove the current board passed with 78% of the vote. The new board members were elected with similar margins. Barbara was devastated. I watched her face as the results were read, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She had spent years running the HOA, and now she was being decisively rejected by the community. But then I remembered all the unfair fines, the people she had hurt with her excessive enforcement, and my sympathy evaporated. The new board was sworn in immediately. Their first act was to review all fines issued in the past 6 months. They found dozens that were excessive or improperly assessed. Mine were among them. Every fine I had received was refunded, along with an apology. They also implemented new policies. Fines would now be issued only after a warning for first-time violations, except in cases of serious safety hazards. There would be a clear appeals process. Enforcement would be documented and reviewed quarterly to ensure consistency. And perhaps most importantly, the HOA would maintain all common areas properly, including the path to the mailboxes. I resumed salting the path that winter, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The difference was that now I was doing it as part of a community effort, with the HOA providing the salt and other homeowners taking turns helping out. Barbara moved out of Meadowbrook Commons that summer. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband bought a condo in downtown Chicago where there was no HOA to run. Good for them, honestly. Maybe she would be happier somewhere without the constant power struggles. The following months were peaceful. The new board focused on actual community improvement rather than nitpicking enforcement. They organized neighborhood events, improved the common areas, and generally made Meadowbrook Commons a nicer place to live. But the story does not end there. In late July, I got a call from a lawyer who introduced himself as representing several former board members, including Barbara. My stomach sank. Were they suing me? Not exactly. The lawyer explained that the Illinois Attorney General's office, following up on complaints including mine, had launched an investigation into the former board's financial management. They had discovered that Barbara had been embezzling money from the HOA. It turned out that the reserve fund shortage was not just due to poor budgeting. Barbara had been writing checks to herself for supposed HOA expenses that never actually happened. Fake invoices for maintenance work, reimbursements for purchases she never made, that kind of thing. Over 3 years, she had stolen nearly $50,000. The lawyer wanted to know if I would be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I said yes immediately. The case did go to trial. It took another 6 months, but eventually, Barbara was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though she ultimately served only 8 months before being released on parole. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, which she did by selling her condo and liquidating other assets. The whole situation was sad in a way. Barbara had let power and greed corrupt her, and it destroyed her life. But I could not muster much sympathy. She had made people's lives miserable with her petty enforcement while stealing from the community she claimed to be protecting. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson about standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. That first fine for ice on my steps had seemed like a minor annoyance, something I should just pay and forget about. But it was symptomatic of a deeper problem, and by refusing to let it go, I ended up improving life for everyone in Meadowbrook Commons. The new HOA board operated transparently and fairly. Property values actually increased, despite Barbara's warnings that lax enforcement would destroy the neighborhood. Turns out people prefer living in a community where they are treated with respect rather than constantly looking over their shoulder for the next violation notice. I stayed in my house in Naperville for several more years. Eventually, my job relocated me to Wisconsin and I sold the place. But I stayed in touch with my former neighbors. Tom became the HOA president and did an excellent job. Mrs. Patterson sent me a Christmas card every year until she passed away peacefully at 92. The neighborhood remained a pleasant place to live. Looking back, the whole saga taught me several things. First, HOAs are only as good as the people running them. The rules and structures matter, but ultimately, it comes down to whether the board members are acting in good faith or abusing their power. Second, communities work best when people are willing to stand up against unfairness, even when it is easier to just go along. If I had paid those fines and moved on, Barbara would have continued her behavior, and the embezzlement might never have been discovered. Third, and perhaps most importantly, doing favors for your neighbors is good, but you should never let those favors be used against you. When I was salting the path to the mailboxes, I was genuinely trying to help. But when Barbara tried to turn that into an obligation I could be punished for not fulfilling, it became clear that the dynamic was unhealthy. After the new board took over, I went back to helping with the path, but on my own terms and as part of a community effort, not as an unspoken requirement. The ice on my steps, that little patch of frozen water that started everything, became a neighborhood legend. People would joke about it at community events. Remember when Connor's ice took down the entire HOA board? It was funny because it was kind of true. That one violation notice led to the discovery of embezzlement, the removal of corrupt leadership, and the transformation of how our community operated. I also learned a lot about Illinois HOA law, probably more than any homeowner should ever need to know. But that knowledge proved valuable. I ended up helping friends in other neighborhoods who were dealing with similar issues. I became something of an informal consultant on HOA disputes, which was never something I expected to be, but life takes you strange places. The experience also changed how I thought about community involvement. Before all this, I was pretty passive. I went to work, came home, mowed my lawn, and that was about it. I did not attend HOA meetings or really pay attention to how the neighborhood was run. After going through the battle with Barbara, I realized how important it is to be engaged and informed. Democracy, even at the neighborhood level, requires participation. When people check out and let others make all the decisions, you get situations where power-hungry individuals can run amok. My new neighborhood in Wisconsin had an HOA too, and you can bet I paid close attention from day one. I attended meetings, read the budgets, asked questions. I even ran for the board after living there for a year, though I did not win. That was fine. Just being involved and keeping an eye on things was enough. The board there was actually pretty reasonable, and I never had any major issues. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just paid that first fine and moved on. Would Barbara have eventually been caught anyway? Would someone else have stood up to her? Or would she have continued for years, making people miserable and stealing from the HOA until she drained it completely? I will never know, but I am glad I made the choice I did. The whole experience reinforced my belief that most people are basically good and reasonable. The overwhelming support I got from neighbors when I pushed back against unfair enforcement showed that people recognize injustice when they see it. They just sometimes need someone to take the first step, to be willing to stand up and say, "This is not right." Once one person does that, others will often follow. I also gained respect for the few board members like Tom who were trying to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Tom could have stayed silent and coasted through his last year before moving, but he spoke up and eventually helped lead the reform effort. That took courage, especially when it meant going against Barbara, who could be intimidating. The legal process that followed the embezzlement discovery was eye-opening too. I had never been involved in a criminal case before, even as a witness. Sitting in that courtroom, watching Barbara's trial, was surreal. This woman who had been such a dominating presence in our neighborhood looked small and defeated in her defendant's chair. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had only borrowed the money and intended to pay it back, that it was poor judgment rather than criminal intent. The jury did not buy it. When I testified, I explained how the aggressive fine enforcement had seemed financially motivated, how Barbara had mentioned budget shortfalls, how the pattern of behavior suggested she was trying to generate revenue while simultaneously stealing. My testimony was just one small piece of a much larger case, but the prosecutor later told me it helped establish motive and pattern of behavior. After Barbara was sentenced, several other former board members from other HOAs came forward with their own stories of financial irregularities. It turned out Barbara had been involved in HOA leadership at her previous residence too, and there were questions about money management there as well. That case never went anywhere legally because too much time had passed, but it painted a picture of someone who had found a way to exploit a system and had done it repeatedly. The restitution process was complicated. Barbara had to pay back the $50,000 she stole, plus interest and court costs. She sold her condo at a loss because she needed cash quickly. Her husband divorced her during the trial, which apparently freed up some of his assets that she was able to access. The HOA eventually got most of the money back, which they used to finally replace the community center roof and make other long overdue improvements. One unexpected consequence of the whole situation was that Meadowbrook Commons became somewhat famous in Illinois HOA circles. News articles were written about the case. A local TV station did a segment on HOA reform using our neighborhood as an example. I did a couple of interviews, though I tried to keep a low profile. I did not want to be known as that guy who took down his HOA, but that is kind of what happened anyway. Other neighborhoods reached out asking for advice on how to handle similar situations. I created a simple guide based on my experience. Document everything, know your bylaws, build community support, follow proper procedures, and do not be afraid to escalate if necessary. I shared it freely with anyone who asked. If my experience could help others avoid or resolve HOA conflicts that seemed worthwhile, the irony of the whole situation never escaped me. All I had wanted was to live peacefully in my house, go to work, and not deal with drama. Instead, a fine for ice on my steps turned into a months-long battle that ended with criminal convictions and a complete restructuring of neighborhood governance. Life is strange that way. Years later, when I would tell the story to new friends or colleagues, they would often ask if I regretted how things played out, if all the stress and conflict was worth it. My answer was always the same: absolutely. Standing up for what is right is not always easy or convenient, but it is necessary. If everyone just went along with unfair treatment to avoid conflict, nothing would ever improve. The shared path to the mailboxes, meanwhile, became well maintained under the new board. They paved it properly, installed lighting, and kept it clear of snow and ice all winter. Mrs. Patterson never fell again, and neither did anyone else. That alone made everything worthwhile. Knowing that my actions led to a safer, fairer community was the best possible outcome. I drove back to Naperville a few years after moving to Wisconsin for a work trip. I decided to swing by Meadowbrook Commons to see how things were going. The neighborhood looked great. Yards were well maintained, not because people were afraid of fines, but because they took pride in their homes. The community center had its new roof and a fresh coat of paint. Kids were playing in the common area park, which had new equipment that the old board had always said they could not afford. I ran into Jerry, my old neighbor, who was out walking his dog. We chatted for a while, catching up. He told me the HOA was running smoothly, that Tom had done a great job as president and had just been re-elected for another term. Fines were rare and only issued when truly necessary. People actually looked forward to HOA meetings now because they were productive and civil. "You really changed this place," Jerry said. "I know it probably did not feel like it at the time, but you did." I thanked him, but the truth was that it was not just me. It was everyone who signed the petition, who voted in the election, who supported the reform effort. Change requires collective action, not just one person making noise. As I drove away from Meadowbrook Commons that day, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. That patch of ice on my steps all those years ago had been the catalyst for something much bigger than I could have imagined. It exposed corruption, brought a community together, and ultimately made life better for everyone who lived there. The experience also made me a better homeowner and community member. I learned to read the fine print, to ask questions, to not assume that people in authority always have good intentions. I learned the importance of documentation, of building coalitions, of following proper procedures even when you are fighting against unfairness. Most importantly, I learned that you should never underestimate the power of one person refusing to accept something wrong. That first fine could have been the end of the story. I could have paid it, grumbled to my friends, and moved on. Instead, by saying no, this is not right, I set in motion a chain of events that improved an entire community and brought a criminal to justice. Looking back now, from the comfort of my home in Wisconsin, I sometimes think about Barbara and wonder what she is doing. She got out of prison years ago. I heard she moved out of state, trying to start fresh somewhere where people did not know her story. Part of me hopes she found peace and learned from her mistakes. Another part of me figures she is probably doing something similar in a new community, because people like that rarely change. But that is not my problem anymore. I did my part. I stood up when it mattered and good things came from it. That is all any of us can really do. The ice on my steps melted long ago. That winter transitioning to spring and then to all the seasons that followed. But the impact of what started that cold February morning in Naperville lives on in a neighborhood that runs better, in people who learn to stand up for themselves, and in my own understanding of what it means to be part of a community. Would I do it all again, knowing what I know now? In a heartbeat, because some things are worth fighting for, even if it starts with something as small as ice on your steps and a $200 fine. Sometimes the smallest injustices reveal the biggest problems, and having the courage to address them, no matter how uncomfortable, is what makes communities work. That is the real lesson from all of this. Not that HOAs are inherently bad or that you should always fight every battle. But that when something truly is not right, when people are being hurt or taken advantage of, speaking up matters. It matters for yourself, for your neighbors, and for everyone who comes after you. The path to the mailboxes is clear now, in more ways than one.